Today's scripture reading comes from the Old Testament book of Job, not one of the more popular books to preach from a lot of the time. It comes from Job 38, verses 1 through 11, and 16 through 18. Job 38, 1 through 11, and 16 through 18. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man. I will question you, and you shall declare to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. For who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment, and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribed bounds for it, and set bars and doors, and said, Thus far shall you come and no farther, and here shall your proud ways be stopped. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the gates of deep darkness? Have you comprehended the expanse of the ocean? Declare if you know all this. We're currently in the period of the church calendar, which many churches have designated as the season of creation. And it runs from September 1st through the day commemorating St. Francis of Assisi on October 4th. Throughout the season of creation, we'll be focusing on different aspects of creation, examining what Scripture has to say about creation, and what we as followers of Jesus Christ are supposed to do in our interactions with creation. Last week we talked about the event of creation and discussed the fact that it's okay for Christians to have differing opinions on how creation was accomplished. Whether someone believes that God created everything in 6 literal days, and that the earth is only 6,000 years old, or if they believe that God created everything over the course of billions of years, or if they believe that God ordained the process of evolution. It really doesn't matter. What matters is that God called his creation very good. God gave us creation to sustain us, but he also put us in the position to take care of it. And quite frankly, we haven't been doing a very good job of that. Perhaps some of you are aware of the phenomenon known as the Pacific Garbage Patch. And my slide isn't working here, but that's okay. The Pacific Garbage Patch is just one part of 5 offshore plastic accumulation zones in the world's oceans. It's halfway between Hawaii and California. It covers an approximate surface area of 1.6 million square kilometers, which is an area twice the size of Texas. Scientists estimate that every year, 2.6 million tons of plastic are entering the ocean. 2.6 million tons. That's 5.2 billion pounds of plastic. The same weight as approximately 240 billion plastic water bottles, which is enough to fill every inch of the Houston Astrodome twice. And that's what's happening each year. More than half of this plastic is less dense than water, which means that it'll float once it gets to the ocean. And once these plastics enter the giant vortex of the Pacific Patch, they're unlikely to leave the area until they degrade into smaller microplastics under the effects of the sun and the water and marine life. And as more and more plastics are discarded into the environment, microplastic concentration will only continue to increase. Midway Atoll is an island group, one of the most remote areas in the world. It's an area that's closed to the public and is only able to be visited after a long and rigorous application process. Yet the main inhabitants of Midway Atoll are falling victim to our plastic addiction. And I've got a video about that, but I warn you, this video is a little bit unsettling. If you have a weak stomach, you may not want to watch, but I think it's an important illustration.
For all the fish and squid they catch, the albatross bring back plastic too, from that great Pacific Garbage Patch. Goodale showed us their nesting grounds.
So here we do have a chick that did die, as you can see if you want to take a look at it. food source, so this looks like it's squid to them.
So they think this is food?
They do think it's food, and you know, flying fish, they can lay eggs on floating debris, and so they will absolutely lay eggs on floating plastic. So if the adults are out for the foraging, they pick up those eggs as well as the plastic in there.
It's the serving fish for you.
Yes.
And of the birds that you end up looking at, dissecting, what percentage of them have plastic?
Every single bird has plastic.
Every bird.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife scientists estimate the birds carry 5 tons of plastic back to Midway in their stomach every year. Some of it, Kelly Goodale collects and catalogs.
This one is coming from the serving ones. This was, oh my goodness, you have bottle plastic here.
It's like trash at the drugstore.
Pretty much that.
Okay, all of this was in the bird.
Yeah.
That's pretty tragic. And of course, this is just the tip of the tip of the tip of the iceberg. To state the obvious, this is bad news for everything that relies on the oceans for life, which is pretty much everything. See, because the water cycle, scientists have even found pieces of microplastic in rain. Rain. That means when water comes from the sky to water our crops, it's bringing with it microplastics, the chemicals from which can be picked up by the roots of crops. So everything that lives in the ocean, everything that eats anything from the ocean, everything that needs rain to grow, everything that eats anything that needs rain to grow, and everything that drinks water to survive is getting affected by the levels of plastic that end up in the water. And it's humanity's fault that these are the current conditions. Professor and environmental lawyer John Kunich wrote his book, Killing Our Oceans. We human beings are almost entirely responsible for the massive die-off in our oceans. So why should we not be responsible about it? It's the shopworn shopkeeper's motto writ large. You break it, you buy it. All over the world, we're breaking the vast, ancient, but fragile structure of marine life. And if we don't pay to undo the damage, it will only spread and worsen. We have a moral duty to do all we can to halt and reverse the harm we're inflicting upon this most precious and least understood of natural resources. Okay, some of you are getting antsy because you thought you were coming to church, not a lecture about plastic pollution in the oceans. Okay, and you're wondering when I'm going to get to talking about the Bible and something spiritual. Okay, so here's a quote from Shane Claiborne, Christian author and activist. He says, "There's clear biblical evidence of a God who has a green thumb, a creator who begins the human story by breathing life into dirt and ends the story with the restoration of all creation as New Jerusalem comes to earth. This is a humble and clear call to all people to respond to the degradation of the earth, especially those of us who dare to call ourselves Christians." This is exactly the point that I want to get across. Okay? Our care for creation, or lack thereof, is a spiritual issue. It's an issue of whether or not we're doing God's will, whether or not we're following Jesus Christ, and whether we're seeking to bring His kingdom to bear upon this earth. So let's discuss the passage that we read earlier. Like I said, Job isn't usually a popular book to preach from because it raises an awful lot of really hard to answer questions. But I'm not looking to give a full synopsis and exegesis of the book of Job here. I'm rather interested in what we just read from chapter 38. At this point, Job has undergone a lot of severe tragedy. And he's been crying out to God, asking God, "Why, God? Why are you allowing these terrible things to continue happening to me?" And in the passage we read this morning, God finally shows up and answers out of a whirlwind or out of a storm. This reminds me of a scene from the movie Forrest Gump. Lieutenant Dan, Forrest's commanding officer in the Army, that lost his legs in Vietnam and subsequently became an alcoholic. But he promised Forrest that if Forrest ever became a shrimp boat captain, Lieutenant Dan would come and be his first mate. Well, Forrest had started his shrimping business and Lieutenant Dan kept his promise, but business wasn't going all that well. Forrest had started going to church to pray that God would help him catch shrimp. After another unsuccessful attempt, Lieutenant Dan says to Forrest, "Where's this God of yours?" And Forrest, acting as the narrator, says, It was funny that Lieutenant Dan said that, because right then, God showed up. And the scene then jumps to a huge gale force storm, and while Forrest is hiding below deck, Lieutenant Dan is in the boat's crow's nest, shouting at God for all of the suffering he had endured in his life. And after that, they became the most successful shrimping business in the country, and Lieutenant Dan found peace in his life. It's a very Job-like story. So just like with Lieutenant Dan, God showed up to answer Job. A lot of people read God's response to Job as a beratement, mercilessly scolding Job for daring to question Almighty God. But biblical scholars point out that that's not at all what's going on here. When we read the English translations at face value, it's easy to see how we can arrive at the conclusion that God is just jabbing and deriding poor Job. God shows up and speaks from the storm and says, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" That sounds pretty ominous. But the poet who wrote the book of Job has God appearing out of a storm, not to show judgment, but to show power. The question, "Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge?" is certainly a rebuke, but it's not a condemnation. God's reminding Job that when it comes to the activities of the Almighty, Job had no concept. He's completely in the dark. Job's fault here was that he assumed he had knowledge that he didn't have. He assumed that he understood everything about the world that God had created and about God himself. So God challenges Job in a way that will make it very apparent that Job doesn't have the knowledge that he seems to think he has. God asked Job, where was he when the foundations of the earth were laid? And asked who it was who determined its construction and its measurements. Again, it seems kind of controversial and condemnatory in nature. But then in verse 7, something changes. Dr. Lindsay Wilson, a professor of Old Testament at Ridley College, notes that verse 7, however, adds an interesting twist with the addition of superfluous, almost playful information. There's no need to add that the heavenly beings responded with joy. The idea of the morning star singing is a lighthearted, even comic picture that seems out of place if this is intended as a strong rebuke to Job. The use of humor here softens God's questioning of Job, and this sets the tone for the speech. This is something that we miss just reading at face value in the English tradition. But God's actually throwing jokes in here. The lighthearted nature of the discourse continues in the next verse, as we get God talking about the oceans and the seas, which obviously is the crux of what we're talking about today. God says, "Who shut in the sea with doors when it burst out from the womb?" The portrayal here is that to God, the sea is a newborn baby that's just emerged from the womb. To humanity, the sea has awesome power, unknowable mystery, unconquerable danger if not respected. To God, the oceans are a cute little baby that's just been born. And God goes on to say that he gave the clouds as clothing and swaddled it with darkness. My wife has kept many of the baby onesies from when my kids were little, the ones that we remember them wearing, which they looked particularly cute in. She's making quilts out of them, or at some point in the future we'll make quilts out of them when she has lots of extra time on her hands. But that will be so that we and they can have those memories for a long time. This is how God's describing his view of the ocean. Like a proud parent who birthed the ocean and lovingly clothed the seas and wants to keep those things close to his heart. And like a parent, God also told the seas where they had to stop. When my kids go outside, they know which areas of the neighborhood they're allowed to go to and which areas that they're not allowed to go. God did the same thing for his little baby oceans. He set limits for the waves, and like my children, most of the time, they obey and stay where they're supposed to stay. The final question that God asked Job in relation to the oceans is whether Job has entered the springs of the deep or walked the recesses of the deep. Even in our day, very few have reached the extreme depths of the ocean, in which garbage has also been found, by the way. But in Job's day, such a feat was unthinkable. They couldn't even fathom the idea of going to the deepest parts of the oceans. There's beauty and fascination in mystery. And even though humankind has reached the depths of the Mariana Trench, there are still lots of unknown and unfathomable mysteries in the depths of the sea. And I think there's something beautiful about the fact that there are things in the ocean of which humankind has no knowledge, but which God has been enjoying since the day He created those things. This portrayal of the oceans demonstrates God's ultimate and superior power in comparison to mankind. Whereas the oceans are powerful and mysterious to us, to God they're like a small child with different aspects and personality quirks, which no one sees but a parent. And this illustrates the awesomeness of God, but it also shows us what He thinks about the oceans. The oceans are His creation, and He views them as a parent views a child. He clothes them, and He cares for them, and He smiles with pride as He enjoys watching them roll and toss and sustain life for so many plants and animals. Consider the pain it must cause them, as humans bluntly abuse His creation. Jonathan Merritt, an author and culture writer for several different magazines, and also the son of former Southern Baptist President James Merritt, wrote about the Pacific garbage patch in his book, Green Like God. He wrote, "This floating mass of discarded water bottles, toothbrushes, shopping bags, shampoo bottles, and bottle caps wreaks havoc on marine life. Animals become entangled and die, and as the trash breaks down, fish and birds ingest it. I ask myself what God thinks about us trashing His creation with our selfish, wasteful lifestyles. These tragedies undoubtedly grieve the heart of God. Calamities like this are all around us. So again, I say to you, care for our oceans is a spiritual issue. It's an issue of whether or not we're being obedient followers of Jesus Christ. It's not a political issue, it's not a social issue, it's not a special interest issue. It's an issue of Christian spirituality and obedience. The biggest thing that we can do is to minimize our plastic usage as much as possible. Perhaps you noticed this morning that we replaced our Keurig coffee maker with air pots in the back. That gets rid of 10, 15, 20 plastic K-cups that we were using here each Sunday morning. We'll also be phasing out our individual creamer packages back there as well. As individuals, we can use cloth shopping bags rather than plastic grocery bags, and if we use plastic bags, we can bring them and recycle them. Most stores now have places where you can drop off plastic bags to be recycled. We can stop using single-use plastic water bottles and replace them with reusable ones. Pretty much any time we can avoid using single-use plastic, we should. And any time when we can recycle plastic, we should. Admittedly, it takes a little extra effort on our behalf. It means that our lives will not be quite as convenient and easy as they could be. But that's the case with following any of the commands of Jesus Christ, right? Jesus doesn't necessarily make life easier on us. For the sake of the oceans, God's beloved creation, which He loves as a parent loves a child, for the sake of life on this earth and for the sake of future generations, let us care for our oceans in the name of the one who called all creation very good. I want to leave you with some verses of a hymn entitled The Song of the Waters, written by Norman Abel. View anew the dark blue ocean, whales cavorting, spraying foam, God at play with deep-sea monsters, feeling very much at home. Sing a song of laughing waters, pulsing through the veins of earth. Feel the breath of God move softly, gentle mists that brush the skin. Earth is breathing God's own spirit, life renewed from deep within. Sing a song of living waters, pulsing through the veins of earth. So friends, let us view the ocean anew through God's eyes, and let us love and care for His creation as much as He does. Please pray with me. God, our Creator, as we reflect on the mysteries of the ocean depths, we celebrate the wondrous design of the seas that surround us. Help us to discern how we pollute included our oceans and to empathize with the groaning of creation. Teach us to know the presence of God in the tides, the currents of the seas. Teach us to care for the oceans and all of our waterways. Jesus, teach us with earth. Make our spirit sensitive to the cries of creation, cries for justice from the land, the seas, and the skies. Make our faith sensitive to the groans of the Spirit in creation, the groans of longing for a new creation. Lord, make our hearts sensitive to the songs of celebration from the sea and the forest and the air. Lord, teach us to care. In the name of the wisdom of God, the creative force that designs and governs all of creation.